So last session we discussed about working with the Angular application and the infrastructure, the file system of Angular. And today we will see how we can start working with Angular, how we can define and start working with the Angular environment, right? We will see step by step. So after understanding the Angular workspace, so we need to know about how the Angular application actually works technically. Angular application folder, in that app folder, one file you need to know very perfectly how it actually works. You should know that. Yeah. In our application, Angular projects, in this shopping application, yesterday I showed you so that our application starts with index, and the index starts with a component called app. In the app folder, so you can see a component is already present. That component have a CSS, HTML, spec, TS, all these. Every component have the 4 files here. Not only that, one important file that you will find in app component. So initially you need to know about that file, and that is app module.ts. In every Angular application, this app module.ts is very important. Actually, your application usually comprises of a lot of components, services, modules, and everything. Usually application comprises of so many things. If application have to use the components, that means technically you can design application. You can design application with components, services, so pipes, etc. What are those? We are going to learn one by one. What are services, pipes? We are going to learn about them. But important is you can design application with all these. So every component or service or pipe that you design, so need to be registered, need to be registered in application. Without registering any component that you have designed, you cannot use them. The components that generally you design, they need to be registered. So application will not allow to use the components if they are not registered. It can be anything. It can be a component or a service or a pipe or a module. Whatever you design, you cannot use it until or unless it is registered in the application. And the registration of the components that you have designed is done in this app module.ts. So app module.ts is responsible for is responsible for picking up all the dependencies that are registered and load the dependencies whenever the application is requested, whenever application starts. So if anything that you designed is not registered with app module, then it will not load that into the memory when application starts. That means you cannot use it. So in order to use the components that you have designed for Angular application, you have to register them. You have to register them, and that is done by using that is done in app module.ts. First, you have to import them into app module and register them. You can see that app module.ts. This is the key concept. This is very key concept. In app module.ts, so first you have to import the library that you want to use, and you have to register the library. The registration of library is done in this ng module. Ng module contains the metadata. It contains the metadata. Metadata, that is the information that your application needs to use. In the metadata, you can see that. So you can see in the metadata. So you have declarations, you have imports, you have providers, and you have bootstrap. Now, actually, technically, so here by default some modules are there. We have a browser module, ng module, and by default some app component is there. Actually, every Angular application have declarations. Declaration is the location where we register the components that we have designed. So what are components that we are going to learn now? All Angular components that you have designed, all Angular components that you have designed are registered at declarations, Declarations contains the list of components that are need to be loaded into memory. And the modules that are designed are registered in imports. Modules are registered in imports. Services are registered in providers. Services are registered in providers. So declaration contains components, imports contains modules, and providers contains services. Generally, while working with Angular, you have to know so many things. Basic things are components and pipes, services, and modules. Actually, components are nothing but they are building blocks. They are building blocks for application. Applications are built by using components. For example, every Angular application is designed with a component. For example, login. So on a page you have a login that is called a component. You have register, that is a component. So you have some home, that is a component, some contact, that is a component. So everything is designed as a component, header component, footer component. So everything is designed as a component. What is component? Detailedly we will see. Applications are built with components. Pipes are nothing but pipes are used for formatting your data, filtering your data, sorting your data. All such operations are done by pipes. In Angular, pipes are responsible for formatting, filtering, sorting your data. Services are nothing but they provide a predefined business logic. Services provide a predefined business logic which you can inject and use in any location. Reusable business logic. Services will provide reusable business logic. So technically, we are going to explore all of them one by one. So I'm just giving an overview that Angular contains components, pipes, services, and modules. A module comprises of all of them. That means a module comprises of components, pipes, services. All these are kept in a module. All are kept in a module. So Angular application is built with components, pipes, services, and modules. So the components are registered in declarations. Modules are registered. Components and pipes are registered in declarations. Modules are registered in imports. Providers, services are registered in providers. So what are those you are going to detailedly learn? So initially, declarations, imports, and providers. Now, what is Bootstrap actually? So this is not what you know in HTML, CSS Bootstrap. Actually, Bootstrap means in Angular framework, you need to understand a term called bootstrapping. Bootstrapping. In many interviews, they may ask this question at a fresher level because experienced people, they already know this. That is a regular thing. So bootstrapping is nothing but bootstrapping is the process. It is the process of converting static DOM into dynamic DOM. That means when you load Angular application, when you load Angular application, it immediately will not take control. Angular application will not immediately take control. Angular application, when you request Angular application, so the Angular application will first load the static DOM. After loading the static DOM, it will load all the library required. After loading the library, then it will convert the static DOM into dynamic DOM. It's a process actually. For example, I will show you a simple approach, means how actually happens, a simple approach. So technically in a diagram form here, suppose, so we have client and the client requests your application. So that is client and the client or user. And client is requesting your application. So you designed a web application. So you designed a web application. So this is requested by the client. So this is a web application. So this is a web application created with Angular framework. That means it is used with the Angular framework. So it is designed with Angular framework. We are using Angular framework for this web application. Now, what happens is when client requests this on the browser, first step, what happens is the page loads into browser. So by default index page, that is the page loads into browser. After loading the page into browser, so it loads static DOM. Static DOM is document object model. You know that HTML presents DOM. So it loads the static DOM. It loads the static DOM. Now, after loading the static DOM, so it has to convert this static DOM into dynamic DOM. It has to convert this into static DOM into dynamic DOM. Dynamic DOM. So once it is converted into dynamic DOM, that means now it starts responding with the user. That means now it will handle interaction with the user. User interactions are handled when it is dynamic DOM. The process of converting the static DOM into dynamic DOM, this process is called as bootstrapping. Bootstrapping. Bootstrapping is technically the process of converting static DOM into dynamic DOM. It is the process of converting the static DOM into dynamic DOM. The static DOM into dynamic DOM. So that means the static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM. That is technically bootstrapping actually. That is technically bootstrapping. And important is how it is converted into dynamic DOM. Internally, so much will happen. Internally, so much will happen. That means what happens in the bootstrapping process? In the bootstrapping process, what actually happens? So that is a very lengthy hierarchy. Outline I will tell you. In the bootstrapping process, what happens is, so first step, what happens is, after loading the page into memory, so it loads Angular framework. It loads the Angular framework. That means after loading the page into memory, it loads the Angular framework. It means after loading the static DOM, it loads the Angular framework. So Angular framework so loads all the library required for application. All the library required for the application is loaded by this Angular framework. And that is done with the help of a file called, from where it will pick up the library. So I told you that Angular uses a modular library. Modular library means entire library is not loaded. It will load only the library that is needed for that particular situation, and it picks up that information from app.module.ts. From app.module.ts file, it will pick the library that is required for that application. So it will pick that library required for application. After picking the library required for the application, so by the help of injector, so Angular have an injector, and that injector is managed by a file called main.js. I already told you. So here it is TS file, main.ts. So this injector is used for this injector. What it will do is, this injector which is managed by main.js, this injector will load the required components. So it will load the required components. After loading the required components, so it will compile by using JIT or AOT compiler. Compiled by using JIT or AOT compiler. So it loads the required components. It will compile. It will compile by using JIT or AOT. It will compile by using JIT or AOT, and after that it converts that into the dynamic DOM. It will convert that into the dynamic DOM. That means the framework will control the entire application flow, and it loads it. Once it is compiled, it is converted into dynamic DOM. That means it starts interacting now. This is what happens in the bootstrapping process. So that means application will undergo the process of converting the static DOM into dynamic DOM. Actually, JavaScript, jQuery, every client-side libraries and frameworks intention is to convert the static DOM into dynamic. For that, they have their own process and flow. And that is what generally we call as bootstrapping. So don't get confused with bootstrap and bootstrapping. So when anyone talks about just bootstrap, that means just a repository of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Bootstrapping, it is the process of making your application ready. So that is what booting actually. So bootstrapping. So that means here bootstrap indicates there are so many components in your project. From which component you want to start. That means which component you want to start, which component user have to start. So that means the component, which component we need to show to the client. So the startup component we have to define in this bootstrap. Currently it is starting with app component. Application can start with many components. That's the reason you can see these are all arrays. So imports is an array type, declarations is an array type, providers is an array type, bootstrap is an array type. An application can start with multiple components, but from which component application have to start, you have to mention in this. So it's very important to tell from which component it should start. Remember, the component that you have mentioned to start in bootstrap must be defined in index. It should match with index. That means in index page, which component you are rendering, that component must be defined in bootstrap. That is very important. If bootstrap is not matching with index component, then it will throw an error. It will say that you are trying to start a different component and you are trying to render a different component. I cannot render that component because I cannot compile it. So it will compile only the component that is defined inside this bootstrap for initial startup. That is the reason the component that you are requesting in index page, that must be defined in bootstrap. So components may be one or many. You can start with many components at a time, or one component, depends on your requirement. So understanding this app module is very much important. So if anyone asks what is this @ng module, actually @ng module, we generally call it as a directive. There are so many directives. @module, @component, so several directives will be there. So usually a directive is responsible to tell the compiler about what are the components it needs to compile and process. ng module is a directive which tells the compiler to compile specific components, modules, and services that are required for application. So that means what a compiler needs to understand about components and services and all that is provided by this ng module. It is a directive. Several directives you will come across. We call this as directive. What is the role of a directive is to make the compiler understand about what it needs to compile. what it needs to process. If anything is not provided by this ng module, it cannot be compiled and processed. So that is the basic thing you need to understand. So that is the important point about all the components inside this app module.ts. So this file is very important for application startup. And in this file, you configure the library, but application starts with index.html. So, and that is triggered by using main.js. That is triggered by using main.js, right? So bootstrapping is very important to understand how the bootstrapping process works and all. Now, how the application architecture works, Angular application architecture, how application works, a basic application architecture also you have to know. How Angular application works, what is the basic architecture of Angular application. This is general flow. This is general flow. So that means the process of converting static DOM into dynamic DOM. Technically, how Angular application is built, actually, how the Angular application is built, what are used in the Angular application. Let's see. So that is Angular architecture. So Angular architecture, application architecture. That means how Angular application is built, so that you can understand how do we build it. So the basic Angular application architecture is how actually it is built is usually, so we have a combination. That means generally, so we will have a factory. Generally, we will have a factory. Actually, factory is a term. It is used for, so a set of related type of functions. A set of related type of functions. Factory is a collection. Factory is a collection of functions. It is a collection of related type of functions. So the functions required for different functionality, all the functions are defined in a factory. So generally, we have a factory of functions. Now these functions we have to use in our application, but we don't directly use this factory of functions. What we do is, with the help of an injector, so we inject these functions into services. Inject these functions into services. We will create services. That means a set of functions are defined in a service. A collection of several services. A service is a collection of factories. A factory is a collection of functions, and a service is a collection of factories. So many types of factories can be kept inside the services. Now generally we have an Angular application. Angular application needs to use these services, factories and services. Angular application will not directly use a factory. At high level interviews for experienced people, this type of question is also regularly asked, architectural based for experienced people. The question is, why you cannot use a factory directly in application if you want functions, and functions are present in a factory? Why you don't use a factory directly into application? So why you inject this factory into service and use this service in your application? So this is a question asked regularly at high level. So because remember, the word factory is never used by any learner of Angular. If you hear the word factory from any person who is related to Angular, that means so he is talking so much in depth about the architecture. You will never even find the word factory. So in Angular, even you even Google, but this is the term that is used by experts in Angular. They regularly use this factory because they know how Angular is built. So generally learners just know how what Angular provides. So but experts know how they are built with, how the library is built. So that is the reason this term is used only by experts in Angular. They know that their library is built with factories. So that is actually how a library is built also. So they know that it is built with factory. At that level, if you show 5-7 years experience in this kind of development process, they will ask you why you are not using factory, why you are injecting into a service and using that service in application. We will not use a factory because actually factories follow a single call mechanism, single call technique. Factories follow a single call technique. Single call technique means if you want to access any function from a factory, for accessing a function from a factory, every time when you need a function, you need to create an object. You need to create an object. And through that object, you need to access the functions and use the function. That means you created an object and accessed a function. So function 1. I want function 1 again. So if you want function 1 again or function 2 from the same factory, I want another function. Then with the same object, you cannot access that function. You have to create another object for another function. That means for every function, you need to create a new object. Through that object, you have to access it. This is a single call mechanism, So, but service advantage is service uses a singleton mechanism, singleton pattern actually. This is the answer that we have to give, that we use services because it uses singleton pattern. Singleton means object is created only for the first request and only one object is created, and through that object you can access all the functions. So object need not to be created every time. Object is created for the first request and the same object will be used to access all the other functions. So service are designed, a service use singleton pattern actually, singleton mechanism. That is the reason it is good for an application to use a service instead of using a factory. So we will not use a factory because factory single call mechanism. So we use services. Factories are injected into service. And services also, we will not directly use the service in application. What we do is we design a component. And this component is injected with the service. The component is injected with the service and this component is used in application. Why you are injecting the service into the component? Because service contains only the logic. That means service contains only the logic, means only the functionality. So, but it doesn't contain the presentation and interactions. A component comprises of presentation. That means the UI. So it comprises of logic. Logic will come from, logic can be application specific logic, or it can be, logic can be coming from services. And it contains styles with the help of CSS. And this component is injected into application so that application will get the UI. From the UI, it will able to use the services and the functions. So Angular application is completely built with components. Components have the presentation, components have the logic, and components can bring the logic from services, or components can have their own logic. That means every component can have application specific logic, and components can bring the logic from services if they are built already. So services allow to reuse the logic without rewriting it again and again. And these components we inject into application and use. So Angular application is completely built with the components. But components get the logic, so business logic from services. Services gets the functionality from factories. This is the basic hierarchy of an Angular application. The basic hierarchy of an Angular application. So that means component is nothing but it is providing a template. Template means usually template comprises of a design. It comprises of the logic and effects. Everything is present inside the template. Everything is configured and defined inside the template. This template is used by your application. It is used by your application. Actually, this template is used by application and integrated into your application by using a directive we call as directive. So a directive is responsible for integrating this template into the application. Through a directive, we integrate this template into application. So components are integrated into application with the help of directives. So what are directives we are going to see? What are directives we are going to see? That is what important is actually. That is a very major point also. You will understand detailing the concept of directive. Technically, so we have factory. Factory contains collection of functions. Functions are injected into service. Services are injected into components, and components provide a template which is injected into application with the help of directive. Actually, in Angular, you need to know the word directive. Actually, directive in Angular is responsible for making the static dome element into dynamic dome element. Directive is responsible for making the static dome element into dynamic dome element. So it is responsible for making an element into dynamic. For example, suppose we are having so a div. We are having a div. Generally, directive is responsible for doing a lot of things. A directive can can extend HTML. Can extend HTML. Directive can extend HTML and make HTML more interactive. So that means you see, suppose we have a div. Suppose I need to hide this div. Then generally what we do in JavaScript jQuery is we will keep an ID for the div. So, and if I want to hide it, so document dot get element by ID, element by ID, and we say MSG dot style dot display. So display is equal to none to hide it actually. That's how we write that. Suppose you are writing in a jQuery syntax, then we use MSG dot hide is the function we can use. So actually JavaScript, jQuery all requires DOM manipulation. But Angular will handle that by using a directive. You see here, we have a directive. So we just use the directive ngIf, and we will write a condition here. If the condition is matching, it will show. If not matching, it will hide. That means Angular is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. No more DOM manipulations in Angular. It is completely decoupled from DOM manipulations. No get element by ID, no ID references or nothing. And very important is it makes HTML more declarative. This static div becomes a dynamic div with the help of this. So ngIf, it is a directive. That means that is the reason why this technology is named as Angular. So many times the question comes, why it is called Angular? What is the meaning of Angular? Because this technology can make everything dynamic just within this Angular, the configuration within the Angular. So these are Angular braces. This is Angular. This is Angular. And it can handle the static, it can transform the static element into dynamic element just within this Angular. So it doesn't require any DOM manipulations. That means within this Angular, it is going to convert this into a dynamic one. It is going to convert into a dynamic. Now, without this, it is static. Now, when you use this, it becomes dynamic. It becomes dynamic. We don't need anything else other than that. We don't need anything else other than that. So that is what the ability here. That is what the ability here. Later you will see all of them. So project is equal to Amazon. Later you will see all of them. That means how it is managed, how it handles and everything. You can understand, you can see that. But important is it is going to make everything dynamic just within this Angular without needing, without necessary of any external logic to write much. It doesn't mean that it doesn't require logic. It requires logic, but not every time. So that means it can make everything handle within this Angular. That is what the ability is. That is what the ability is. So this is the intention. This is the intention of why they named this as Angular. Why it is called Angular. So directive can extend HTML and make that HTML element more interactive. That means it transforms a static HTML DOM element into dynamic DOM element without using DOM manipulations. That is the important point. Remember, Angular is completely coupled from DOM manipulations. So it will not use any DOM manipulations. It is completely hierarchy. So for example, see now, let's launch this here. So I'm accessing this local host and you see some is there Amazon shopping. Now here Amazon shopping, it is actually coming from app component HTML. I showed you. So here I have a paragraph, welcome to Angular. So I made some changes inside this app component HTML and saved it. And it will show that welcome to Angular. And in this paragraph, I'm just using a directive, ngIf, a directive, and I set some false. That means I set a Boolean value false for that. And you can see it is not there. It is not there. It is simply hidden. And I set it to true. That means you can see it is there. That means you can dynamically control. For example, later you are going to learn all these options. Suppose I put a checkbox, I put a button, on button click, I want to show or hide, I can pass a dynamic value directly into this. That means this paragraph is static. This makes it dynamic. This true value you can collect from any location, like from a checkbox, you can get the true value and use the true value. From the checkbox, we can access the true value and use it. That's, you will see later how we can manage that. So that means it is completely decoupled from DOM manipulation. No get element by ID, get element by tag. That means you will manage everything inside this Angular itself. That is why it is called Angular. It is called Angular. So this is the basic approach, how Angular is built and how Angular works. That is the basic architecture of Angular also. So I given you a simple architecture of Angular, how Angular works, the basic architecture of Angular. So the infrastructure, how it actually works, the basic architecture. Yeah, this is the Angular architecture. This is the Angular architecture actually. This is the basic Angular architecture. Now here module component, module service, module function, module value. That is nothing but factory, a factory of components, services. So functions, values, all these are factory. The factories are injected. The factories are injected into, so the factories are injected into service. And service is injected into component. And component is a template which is used in your application by using a directive. And very important is property binding, event binding is nothing but property binding is it sends the value to UI. Event binding is identifies the changes in the UI and updates them to the component again. That is what property binding, event binding, which you will learn later. No need to worry about that. That means here we need to just understand three options. What is factory, what is service, and what is a component and directive. So component provides a template which is used in your application with the help of directives. So that means now important is the static. Sorry. So the starting step in Angular, is we have to start from creating components, learning the components. We have to start from building the components. We have to learn from building the components. So how do we build and design the components? These components, so once you build and design the components, these components are injected into application. Later, we will remember, I told you that without a factory also a component can be built. Why? Because a component comprises of presentation and logic that you can build without the service. Services and factories are used when you want the application to reuse the functionality. So from existing, if you want to reuse the functionality, then you have to follow this approach. So technically, this is the basic architecture and infrastructure of Angular application. And so you need to understand the main purpose. You need to understand the main purpose of this app module.ts. Every day we will work with this app module.ts, but we should know some basic things about this. So declarations. So this is the location where we register the components and pipes. And imports, this is the location where we register the modules. And providers, so this is the location where we register the services. Bootstrap, this is the location where we specify from which component you want to start with. And why it is called Bootstrap? So because it is responsible for enabling the component to start with by converting the static DOM into dynamic. So that is what actually bootstrapping is. So the architecture I told you, how the static DOM is converted into dynamic DOM. Now in this entire approach, so now what is the first step? The first step in Angular you have to learn how to design a component. So what is a component and how do we design the component? So by using the components, so we can build our application. So Angular starts with building with the components. So that we will see in our next session, right? In the next session, we will start practically working with this. So that means these are all, remember, these are all, don't think that we haven't started practically immediate. So some people ask how many days this theory you will tell, right? Because you will fail all interviews if you don't know all this actually, 100%. Because majority of the interviews, the questions wire up along these concepts only. If you are not sure about what is bootstrapping, what is a factory, what is a service, why we use them, and you say that I know Angular practically, that's like silly thing. You can't handle interviews. Majority of people fail interviews because they don't know these technical terms, but they know Angular, right? That is the reason. So you need to be aware of that. You need to be aware of that, right? So that is the reason we have to discuss all this. Now, once you know this, now we can start working with our components. That means we start building the components working with. Practically now we will start from components that we'll see in the next session, right? So next session tomorrow, as I told you, tomorrow we don't have a session. Tomorrow is off, and again our next session will be on Monday. Okay.